You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
Hello, my name is Matt, host of the Pirate History Podcast. Pirates rank among the most mythologized and romanticized of all historical figures. It can become easy to forget that pirates were real people that had real-world concerns. If you like tales of high-seas adventure, daring do, and also want to learn more about who Blackbeard supported to be king, you can learn more about all of that at the Pirate History Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 248, Taranto Part 2, The Attack. This week, a big thank you goes out to all of our members for supporting the podcast. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyoftheSecondWorldWar.com/members to find out more. At 6 p.m. on November 11th, 1940, the HMS Illustrious would detach itself from a larger Royal Navy force and begin making its way northeast towards its target. The Illustrious was one of the most advanced aircraft carriers in the world, the first to be fitted with air search radar, and was just at the beginning of a very storied career. As she pulled away with a small group of escorts and moved towards the launching point for Operation Judgment, Admiral Cunningham, the commander of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, would signal, quote, "Good luck, then, to your lads in their enterprise. Their success may well have a most important bearing on the course of the war in the Mediterranean." End quote. The goal for the night was to make a daring attack on the Italian naval base at Taranto, where multiple Italian battleships and cruisers were known to be at anchor. And while the Illustrious was one of, if not the most advanced ship in service with the Royal Navy, the Swordfish torpedo bombers that would execute the attack were precisely the opposite. The Swordfish was not necessarily obsolete, but it was far from the technological marvel that newer aircraft were at this point in the war. But the mission that it was embarking upon had been built around its unique capabilities. Yes, it was slow, it was vulnerable, but it could also fly night operations, which was somewhat exceptional among the carrier-borne aircraft during the early period of the war. That night flying capability would be put to use over Taranto, with the goal of surprising the Italians while also limiting the performance of their anti-aircraft guns. The first wave would be in the air just after 8:30 p.m., and they would be on their way to their date with destiny. While Operation Judgment and the attack on Taranto was the primary goal for the fleet operations during the first 10 days of November 1940, there were several other operations happening all around the Mediterranean at exactly the same time. These operations were designed to flood the zone, so to speak, preventing the Italians from focusing on just one of the fleets and convoys that were moving around. This included several supply convoys as well as a strike force built around another British carrier, the Ark Royal, which would attack the Italian airbase at Cagliari. This attack would be launched on November 9th, and they would be able to do some damage to the facilities and to some reconnaissance aircraft that were on the base. Several of the convoys and task forces would also come under Italian air attack, but Force A, the one with Illustrious and the one that was moving towards Taranto, would be able to dodge the Italian aircraft. The radar that Illustrious carried would prove its worth very quickly, when on November 7th it was able to track an Italian aircraft out to a range of about 25 miles. Just knowing that the aircraft was there, and being able to know through radio interception gear that it had sent no radio messages, was incredibly valuable. No naval force wanted to be spotted by land-based reconnaissance aircraft, but the only thing worse than being spotted was not knowing that they had been spotted. However, on November 9th, more forceful measures were required, with British Sea Gladiators being sent against Italian seaplanes that got a little too close. One of the Italian aircraft would be shot down during this action. Then later in the day, Italian bombers would be detected by Illustrious's radar, with 2 fighters sent against them. Only one of the 15 aircraft were shot down, but more importantly, the rest were forced to drop their bomb loads to escape. Forcing an attack to abort in this way was just as good as shooting them down, really, at least in the short term. Other British groups around the Mediterranean would have a similar experience throughout the days between November 5th and 8th, with the effect that the Italians knew that there was a major Royal Navy operation underway, but they did not have really any idea of what its true purpose was. This is one of those situations that is much easier for us to interpret and understand with our information about British intentions. But for the Italians, all they really had was a bunch of information, vague positions and movements of a variety of different surface groups without even the benefit of perfect information about the size and makeup of each of those different groups. All they could do was keep up the reconnaissance flights and hope that more information would become available and that would somehow give them some insight into the true intentions of the Royal Navy. On the eve of the attack, things were going relatively well for Force A, with the only major issue being the fact that 3 Swordfish had been lost during the previous day's operations. This was critical because the raid on Taranto had originally been planned for 2 British carriers to work together, the Illustrious and the Eagle, but the Eagle had been left behind due to engine issues. A few of its Swordfish had been transferred over to the Illustrious, but that meant that there were still only 24 Swordfish available at the start of the operation, and now there were only 21. The original plan had called for 30. Even with this reduced force, the decision was made to go ahead with the plan, and at 6 p.m. on the 11th, the final stage of the plan started with the Illustrious, along with 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers, separating from the rest of Force A to begin their high-speed run into their attack position. As they began their run, they were armed with the knowledge that their targets were in position, with RAF reconnaissance flights being made over Taranto early on the 11th to confirm that the battleships were present. This report would then be confirmed just before dusk by another reconnaissance flight, with the RAF really coming in clutch during this day of reconnaissance operations. The launch point for the Illustrious was 170 miles from Taranto. The organization of the attack was for the first wave of Swordfish to be in the air at around 8:30 p.m., with 12 aircraft in the first wave. 6 of the aircraft would be carrying torpedoes, the weapon that would probably be doing the most damage, while 4 would be outfitted with bombs. But the most important were the 2 remaining, that carried both bombs and incendiary flares. These flares would be used to provide illumination of the targets, with the goal of dropping them on the eastern side of the anchorage, while the torpedo attacks would come from the west. The hope was that this would allow some really nice backlighting that would help the torpedo aircraft sort of find and engage their targets. While the torpedoes were focused on the battleships, the bombs would be dropped on the dock and oil facilities ashore. The second wave would include 9 Swordfish, although it was supposed to be 12 before the 3 were lost. And there would still be 2 of them equipped with the bombs and the flares, 2 with just bombs, and then 5 with torpedoes. For the second wave, the torpedo aircraft would approach from a different direction, and the bombs would search for targets in the smaller anchorage, where it was expected Italian cruisers could be found. As the first wave of attack aircraft began their journey to Taranto, which would take a little over 2 hours, they quickly ran into a problem. The altitude that they planned on keeping during their cruising time was 6,000 feet, but they ran into some very thick clouds. There was a plan for this, though, and the aircraft began to climb so that they could get above those clouds. But even though they were all trying roughly to do the same thing at the same time, the clouds immediately broke up the formation. While this disorganized the attack a little bit, it did not prevent the attack from going forward, as all pilots had been properly briefed and prepared to carry out their part in the attack without any additional input or guidance from the rest of the strike. It would have an impact, though. I mean, the strikes were planned to happen in a very specific order and to be coordinated, and they would just be a little out of sequence here in the attack that would follow. As the first groups of Swordfish began to approach the target, they realized that the anti-aircraft guns around the harbor were already firing. To quote Charles Lamb, one of the pilots, quote, "For the last 15 minutes of our passage across the Ionian Sea, Scarlet had no navigational problems, for Taranto could be seen from a distance of 50 miles or more because of the welcome awaiting us. The sky over the harbor looked as it sometimes does over Mount Etna in Sicily when the great volcano erupts. The darkness was being torn apart by a fireworks display which spat flame into the height of nearly 5,000 feet." End quote. The exact cause for this anti-aircraft fire and why it started so early is unknown to us, but they had started firing much earlier than they would have if they were actually reacting to the first wave of British aircraft. Now, the fact that they were firing up in the air, even though there was nothing there, wasn't too surprising though, because during this point in the war, especially at night, anti-aircraft fire was often not aimed at specific aircraft, but instead just fired into the sky to try and fill the area with fire, with each gun and battery responsible for a different area. However, when the first British aircraft arrived, and the 2 flare aircraft dropped their flares, there was suddenly a very clear target to aim for, and the anti-aircraft guns would do so, blazing away at the flares with the hope of extinguishing them or hitting the aircraft that had dropped them. None of the British aircraft were around the flares though by this point, and in fact the flares were set to drop about 1,000 feet before they even ignited, so the fire was way off. The increased rate of anti-aircraft fire did provide some even better illumination for the other Swordfish though, which was very welcome. While the flares were dropping, the first attack would begin, with 3 of the torpedo-armed Swordfish moving in. They moved in at around 30 feet above the water, after having cut their engines during their dive down from their 5,000 feet sort of cruising altitude as they moved in on Taranto. The lead aircraft of this trio was given the designation L4A, and it dropped its torpedo on the battleship Cavour, which it would hit. The same ship was also targeted by the other 2 Swordfish. They missed though, and the attack would result in L4A being shot down, ending up in the water. Both of its aircrew would survive to become Italian prisoners, which gives us a cool first-hand look to what was happening in Taranto after the first raid, because they would write about it later. Lieutenant Scarlett, who was the observer in L4A, would later recall, quote, "We put a wingtip in the water. I couldn't tell. I just fell out of the back into the sea. We were about maybe 20 feet up. It wasn't very far to drop. I never tie myself in on these occasions." Then old Williamson came up a little bit later, and we hung about by the aircraft, which still had its tail sticking out of the water. Chaps ashore were shooting at it. The water was boiling, so I swam off to a floating dock and climbed on board that. We didn't know we'd done good with our torpedoes. Thought we might have, because they all looked a bit long in the face. End quote. The second set of aircraft were a bit less organized, with 2 Swordfish hitting the battleship Littorio in a completely uncoordinated attack. One other Swordfish would also drop on the Littorio, but its torpedo would miss and instead would not explode and instead hit the mud at the bottom of the harbor. During all of these attacks, with Swordfish flying every which way around the harbor, they were under fire by Italian guns, with the guns of the Italian cruisers being particularly noted in first-hand accounts as seeming quite dangerous. But as would so often happen during the war, the Swordfish were probably saved by a simple miscalculation on the part of the Italian gunners, with the vast majority of their fire being above the attacking aircraft. While all the commotion was happening in the harbor, the bomb-equipped Swordfish would drop their bombs on various targets, with many of the bombs hitting targets. They hit things, but nothing necessarily super critical. After each Swordfish executed their attack, they turned back out to the sea and began their flight back to the Illustrious, and by that point the second wave was already in the air.
Are you a player in the private equity industry? Troutman Pepper Locke is one of the leading national law firms focusing on middle market private equity. Our podcast, PE Pathways, brings on deal makers to share their thoughts on trends and developments. We do a deep dive into the M&A industry with topics around tax and employment issues, regulatory developments, and much more. Check out PE Pathways wherever you get your podcasts.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
As the second wave was getting ready to take off just before 9:30 p.m., one of the Swordfish waiting on deck slid into one of the other ones, causing damage that meant that the damaged aircraft, L5F, had to be repaired, delaying its takeoff. The other aircraft involved in the accident would take off on time, but then would have to turn back during the flight due to fuel issues. The end result is that only 8 of the expected 9 aircraft would actually execute the second wave of the attack, with the repaired Swordfish catching up to the others just in time. After the new set of flares was dropped by the 2 aircraft that were carrying the flares, the 5 torpedo aircraft began their attack just after midnight. For the second time that night, the torpedo-armed Swordfish tried to find the correct ships to attack in the darkness, with some success. 2 dropped on Littorio with 1 hit, while another was shot down with both crewmen lost. Another hit the battleship Duilio, with the 5th barely escaping the fire from the Vittorio Veneto, missing the battleship with its torpedo, only to then have its torpedo hit the Cavour instead. For the bombing aircraft of the second wave, only 1 would actually make it to the harbor, with the other having to turn back as mentioned earlier. The solo bomber would drop its bombs on the Italian heavy cruiser, hitting the Taranto, rupturing its fuel tank. By 12:35 a.m., all of the surviving aircraft were on their way back to the Illustrious. As the first planes of the first wave began to near the point where they were supposed to meet the Illustrious, they would pick up the carrier's transponder signal. This could be detected about 50 miles from the carrier, and used a radio signal to give the returning Swordfish the carrier's location so they could move in to land. The landing went very smoothly, with the only issue being one Swordfish running into another while it was taxiing. Landing all of these aircraft in such a tidy manner was pretty impressive, given the fact that the pilots had been flying for over 6 hours, and it was a night landing at around 1 a.m. 18 of the Swordfish that had arrived over Taranto would eventually return, and the crews were just as joyous as you might expect. To quote Lieutenant M.R. Mond from the Swordfish E4F, quote, "My God, I am hungry. I feel as though we had not eaten, drunk, or slept for days. We circle once before the raised deck lights go on. The 3 bright lights ahead are the deck landing control officer telling us, 'Steady approach.' The flight deck is suddenly beneath us. Back throttle stick, a pause, the gentle brush of wheels on the deck, and the wires have got us." End quote. Damage reports began to be collected and analyzed immediately, and while the exact situation was unclear, it was clear that some of the Italian ships had at least been hit. The hope was that firm information would arrive from RAF reconnaissance aircraft based out of Malta the next day. When those flights did occur, the information that they provided was not perfect, but what was clear was that 3 Italian battleships had been damaged to some extent. This left Admiral Lister with a decision to make. While the first night of attacks had not been as costly as was feared, he still decided to cancel the planned second night of attacks. This was because Illustrious would have to stay in the region for another night and another day, and because it was feared that the Italians would be more prepared for the second attack, and they were already down several Swordfish. It was felt to be simply too much of a risk, and so the Illustrious turned and began to move towards its rendezvous with the rest of Force A. While the British would only learn of the exact damage that the attack had done over time, for the Italians on the spot the situation was clear very quickly. The immediate impact of the attack was that on November 12th, there were 3 Italian battleships that were damaged in some way: the Littorio, the Conti di Cavour, and the Duilio. Of these, the Littorio was both the most important and appeared to be the most heavily damaged. It was the newest and largest of the 3 battleships that were damaged, being the lead ship of the Littorio class that had been constructed in the late 1930s. It had been hit by 3 torpedoes, with 2 hitting the bow and 1 the stern. The stern torpedo essentially destroyed the Littorio's steering, while the 2 in the bow caused so much flooding that the ship sank exactly where it was. In deeper water, it probably would have sunk completely, but in the shallow water of the port, it just sort of settled on the sea bottom, while the stern was able to stay above the water. An important delay in trying to repair the ship was the presence of that British torpedo that I mentioned earlier that got stuck in the mud and did not explode. Since it had not exploded during the attack, and was also very difficult to move because of the danger of it, exploding, it had to be handled very carefully. This would delay the movement of the Littorio into a dry dock until mid-December, a month after the attack took place, and given the other damage that the ship suffered, honestly, that torpedo that was stuck in the mud might have had a greater impact on its return to service than it may have had if it would have impacted the ship as expected. I mean, it kept it out of service for an entire month. The Littorio would eventually be repaired, though, and would return to service in May 1941, with it being given the greatest focus during the repair efforts. The Duilio would take longer to bring back into service. It had been hit by a single torpedo that impacted between the A and B turrets, and while water would quickly rush in, there was still time to move the ship so that it could be beached with the help of some tugs that were available, so it would basically just sink in shallower water. The movement of the ship into water that was just 40 feet deep would make it easier to refloat the ship, and by January, that work to refloat it had been done. At that point, it was able to make its way back to Genoa, where actual repairs would occur. It would be back with the fleet in May 1941, just like the Littorio. The Conti di Cavour was a different story, even though it had only been hit by one torpedo. That torpedo had hit below a turret, creating a hole large enough to span 2 watertight compartments, which, when flooded, rapidly caused the forward area to begin filling with water. Tugs were brought in to tow the ship into shallower water, but by dawn it was fully on the bottom in 50 feet of water, which brought the water over the surface deck. The efforts to refloat the ship took some time, as all the guns and large amounts of its armor had to be removed before it could be brought up off the bottom. With so much work having been done, there was a tremendous amount of work that needed to be done to put it back together. And that work would actually never be completed during the war. It would never re-enter service. The British would not know every single detail, but it would become clear quite quickly that 3 Italian battleships, along with the cruiser Taranto, which was also damaged, had been damaged to an extent where they would not be able to participate in actions, at least immediately. And this changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Given all the other threats faced by the Royal Navy around the world, this actually allowed the battleships Malaya and Ramillies to be sent out of the Mediterranean to other theaters. The news of the attack would be known around the world very quickly, with Churchill announcing it to Parliament like this, quote, "The Italian communique of 12 November, in admitting that 1 warship had been severely damaged, claimed that 6 of our aircraft had been shot down, and 3 more probably. In fact, only 2 of our aircraft are missing, and it's noted that the enemy claimed that part of the crews had been taken prisoner. I felt it my duty to bring this glorious episode to the immediate notice of the House, as the result of a determined and highly successful attack, which reflects the greatest honor of the fleet air arm. Only 3 Italian battleships now remain effective. This result, while it affects decisively the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean, also carries with it reactions upon the naval situation in every quarter of the globe." End quote. Now, obviously, Churchill was more than ready to talk up anything that could be spun as anything even close to a success in late 1940, when there was little that seemed to be going well for the British. But in this case, he was not lying about any of that. The British attack had been incredibly successful at very low cost. Nobody liked to lose aircraft, but trading 2 to 4 dead airmen, maybe 2 were captured, hopefully, for heavily damaging 3 capital ships was better than anyone could have hoped for. However, when looking at the general course of the war in the Mediterranean, things did not necessarily change as much as you might expect for half of the Italian battleships to be out of their order of battle. Just because the Italians had a few battleships out of action did not mean that the Royal Navy could just go anywhere. There was still the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, to worry about. Of the 5 books I've read specifically on Taranto for these episodes, all of them spent the last part of the book criticizing Cunningham and the British in the aftermath of Taranto. The general evaluation of those historians is that whatever advantage Taranto provided was simply wasted by the British in the months that followed. There were no major attacks to try and cripple the Italian Navy further. There were no major actions to try and change the war in the Mediterranean in a more permanent way. Things just kind of continued as normal. What the commanders at the time could not have known was that their window for operations as the British Royal Navy in the Mediterranean was closing. And in 1941, first the invasion of Greece and then the increased German presence around the Mediterranean would make everything more difficult. I'm a bit more hesitant to criticize the British leaders too much here. I think what actually happened after Taranto is that the world just had a perfect example of how removing a few capital ships from a fleet did not necessarily change, at least decisively change, any situation during the Second World War. There were simply too many other threats and too many other sources of power that the Italians had access to. And the British in late 1940 and very early 1941 were not in a position to really take advantage of any major weakness. They did not have the men or even the naval power to decisively shift the course of the campaign in the Mediterranean, and in fact, they pulled naval power out as soon as the damage to the Italians was known. This meant that the raid on Taranto was always going to be, at best, an operation that would damage the ability of the Italians to use their fleet and make them hopefully more cautious to do so in the future. But that did not mean it was not a major victory, one that made for an amazing propaganda victory, if nothing else. The victory was like a pressure relief valve on the Royal Navy at a time when pressure was continuing to build in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And that pressure would only get worse when the events in Greece demanded a major British response, which will be our topic for next episode.